Welcome back to the podcast, everybody.
What is good?
Hello.
We have Pastor Nathaniel, Pastor Derek, myself, Matt. This is the 100th episode.
Woo!
Like total or like since we've recorded? Video?
What do you mean? Have you been doing episodes where you weren't recording?
Yeah. Well, we weren't
Nathaniel
recording.
just in his closet, just talking to himself.
You guys remember that?
Episode
Doing
8.
personal episodes.
I actually see things.
I went back and I think like this predates me. So as long as you guys have been, I went back and I think
I
that's
remember
what
there were
we're
a couple
wondering.
weeks we were just doing it on an iPhone
That's right.
without a
Yep.
video.
Oh, those count.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay.
Those count.
So
Yeah.
like the 100. Okay, wow.
So for this episode, someone had asked a question about, they said, in this sermon, Nathaniel mentioned he was briefly an atheist in high school. Can you share your spiritual journey? And I said, you know what, for this episode, let's just do you guys, your spiritual journeys. And also for everyone listening, we have like 1,000 questions.
A million.
So we're not going to do all
Nine,
these
but
in
yeah.
this episode.
Literally.
Yeah. But we are going to try to at least answer some of those and drop them on a second podcast this week. So
Come on.
if you're listening to this, you'll probably have another one drop within the next 2 days. I'll drop it before Sunday.
And we're probably going to do it back to back. So if you're like, they just all wore the same clothes.
Yeah.
If you're watching, we're
Yeah.
going back to back, right?
This is digestible.
Maybe we should actually just every time we do a podcast wear the same clothes and see who comments on that. You know?
Someone once commented when I was wearing like clogs that I should wear socks, which I thought that was really fun.
We're getting fashion advice.
I was like,
Yeah.
thanks guys. Random people on the internet who I don't know.
Yeah.
They were like, socks, please. Like,
That sucks.
so your prayer requests have been answered. Oh boy. I just need my mic. Okay.
That's awesome.
All right, let's do it. So let's start off, Nathaniel. Why don't you start us off and why don't you share, unless you want to go first, Derek.
No, go and let him go.
Share your spiritual journey, man. How'd we end up here? And
And specifically, how did you end up as a Presbyterian?
I know. I'm just
I
not.
love
Yeah.
that
I'm
question.
just not noticing that part of the question.
That's a good question.
you
Well,
have
thanks for the question, person who I don't know who asked it. I feel like I haven't like shared my spiritual journey in like a non 5-minute form in like a long time. It's always like, just give us your
Elevator speech.
Yeah, give us your very long top of the Empire State Building elevator speech. So bear with me. I haven't prepped anything for this. So I grew up in a Christian home to two parents who love Jesus, family who love Jesus. But when let me just back up. All throughout my childhood, I asked questions. Sometimes to the headache of my parents, like why? Like if I was told to do something, I'd always be like, why? I think my parents at one point said, we're going to put why on your tombstone,
That's rough.
which assumed like I would die.
to which you
before them.
to which you responded, wait, why?
But why though? Yeah. And so, yeah, I was just very much like asking questions, probably when I shouldn't be like, can I go over to my friend's house? No. Well, why not? So I just really wanted to know things. Growing up in church, I always was very inquisitive and wanted to know why the preacher was saying what the preacher was saying. I often would not listen to the sermons and just kind of like scroll through my Bible and ask questions to my parents in the middle of the sermon about the Bible, which was probably really annoying in hindsight to them. Sorry, guys, if you're listening. Yeah, and so that kind of began to overflow into doubt because I didn't really feel like a lot of people were willing or interested or able to answer some questions. In particular, I think of just one random question I had as a third grader, which is just funny looking back on it. I went to a Christian school. I was homeschooled kindergarten through second grade, Christian school, third and fourth, and then public school, all the rest. But in third grade, we did like an Easter egg hunt at the Christian school. And I was very upset by it because I feel like now looking back, I'm like, I haven't changed very much. I was just very upset. Maybe this is when I started being a Presbyterian, because an Easter egg hunt doesn't fit with the regulative principle. It's all making sense now. But I just was very upset and started crying because I was just like, this is not about Jesus. Why are we doing this? This is a Christian school. And no one could give me an answer on why we do Easter egg hunts.
How old were you again?
I was like 7.
That's awesome.
I just remember being deeply disturbed. My conscience was seared. I was a TR from the beginning. I'm just kidding. Anyway, but yeah, there were a lot of random things I would ask, like some of them good questions, some of them stupid questions. But like the older I got, I started like really wrestling with like depression. And more specifically, I was asking questions like, why would a good and loving God, who's also evidently all powerful, allow evil things to happen, both on a global scale, but also even on a personal scale? And I've always been a very cynical person. It's the Easter egg story, but even like in youth group and church, I was very much like, all of this seems too good to be true. My main like pushback against the faith was like, it almost seems like somebody designed this to be what we want it to be. And every time you have a question about it, like, how can a good and loving God who's all powerful allow evil and suffering? There's always an answer that doesn't really get to the bottom of it. So what I was usually told is like, it's a mystery. I'm like, that's a cop-out answer. Or, you know, yeah, I would just ask questions about like, why, like another question I asked was, why doesn't God make himself really, really obvious? Like why, like, as I was wrestling with like, is God present with me? I feel like God is distant. Why doesn't he just like show up and be like, hey, I'm here. I love you. Okay, bye. Have a good day. Or, you know, something like that. I didn't really have a preconceived idea what that would look like. And someone would just say, well, you know, it's a mystery. We don't, and I was just like, you're not answering my questions. Like you're just punting them essentially. And that just really eventually got to me. And I just got to a point like in high school where I was like, I don't really believe that. Like it's too good to be true. And I mean, I later found out this was like Freud's kind of critique of Christianity. I didn't know Sigmund Freud as a freshman in high school, but Freud would argue that like a lot of Christians are Christians, not because they're dumb and they're denying the facts, but because they have some unfulfilled longing, that they're basically wishing Christianity into existence. Like they want there to be more than death. Or they want there to be more than just this life, and they want there to be more than after death. So they invent a religion, or they side with the religion that offers it. They want to be known and loved. And so they side with the faith that knows and loves them. And so those things just started adding up as I was like, Christianity is good if it was true, but it just seems like wish fulfillment kind of thing because nobody's answering the holes in the theory. And so long story short, maybe not that short, there was just a point, I remember my freshman year, I had a close friend and I kept asking her these questions and she just couldn't answer them.
Freshman year of high school?
Freshman year of high school, yeah. And kind of just realized like, I don't actually believe this anymore, and quietly became a non-believer. I feel like today it's more popular for like people to deconstruct their faith, but that's essentially what it was a deconstruction. I just didn't do that publicly because I was kind of terrified, and the Bible Belt culture, that was not a popular thing to do. So I didn't let people know that I'd done that. But yeah, for about, I'd say 6 months ish. I mean, my memory's kind of foggy of this period, but I remember it was a good chunk of time, at least a few months, but I want to say 6 months, where it was just very much like very, very dark spiritually. Like the thing I felt, sorry, it's getting kind of dark quick. The thing I felt most real was like darkness. And so I would listen to like horrible, horrible music, like death metal stuff. I remember Eminem's album Relapse was just like on repeat. And honestly, just some like demonic stuff. Like that's why I have, you know, I'm very cautious about the demonic, because I do think in that period of my life, there was like a demonic oppression, self-harm, a lot of very, very dark thoughts, was cutting myself a lot. And long story short, I keep saying long story short, it's not short. There was a point where I actually almost took my life, and just felt like finally there was a presence of the Lord, that he was there. And I don't really know how to put my finger on it in terms of how to describe it. But that sense of absence, those theoretical questions were met with a sense of presence, that God was not just there, but he was good. I feel like, again, I can't go into too many details because I don't fully understand the details. But yeah, that was kind of an atheist, dark, demonically oppressed season of my life. Eventually came to see that God was there. My parents no longer felt like I needed to go into some kind of not foster home, like troubled kids home. There was a season where they were like, do we just like ship this kid off? Because he's like very, very jacked up. And so I still had all my questions though. And thank God there was a guy, there was a youth pastor, Lee Harmon, shout out. You probably never listened to this, but he came in, he was just really, really pivotal in my life. He came in, to be the youth pastor. I was a freshman. They had a kind of a switch up in the youth pastor role at the church I was in. And I think there was like a vacancy for a bit. Anyway, and he was just like a really good preacher, really, really theological. I was in a church that, I want to be careful on the internet, but it wasn't as much like diving into the weeds of the questions. They were really good at like welcoming people who, were on the edges, but it wasn't as much of a concern. Like, let's get really into these nitty gritty questions. And so he really took me under his wing, really, met with me every week for like 3 years. Really had sermons that I felt like they weren't just surface level, like stupid cliches that, I think were a little popular at the time, like just really tweetable one sentence things that you put them under a microscope and they make no sense at all, or they're just really shallow. And he would just really get into the text. He would really, process some of these questions and really taught me, I think, to question my questions. I think what most people do when they deconstruct is they don't deconstruct themselves first. And that's what I had to do. And yeah, I think he also just really called me. He didn't just answer my questions. He really called me into, a life of discipleship. I think I very much only had a notion, not because anybody taught me this, it was just something I caught mostly at my public school, which had a lot of nominal Christians in it. And I was one of them. Just that, you can party on Friday and Saturday, like live not like a Christian at all, Monday to Friday, or Monday to Saturday, and then go to church and do your thing. Oh, and Wednesday youth group, you don't cuss as much. Was kind of my understanding growing up. But then, yeah, he just was like, dude, you got to live this out. And some specific ways he really challenged me were just like, I want you to preach a youth group. So in our youth group, it was like a 2.5 hour affair, and we'd have worship and like a 45-minute sermon. So I don't feel as bad when I go along at youth group, because I'm like, we went longer in my high school. And they were high school and middle schoolers. So all you high schoolers who are like, I can't be with the middle schoolers, we did it. We all, the 6th graders, the 12th graders, packed in this room, and he would just do these, talks. And he was like, I want you to do it next week. And I was like 15 and by no means, should have been doing that. I think there was a period of my life, I kind of like relapsed a little bit into not atheism, but doubt, and started like smoking weed and just doing a bunch of things I shouldn't have done. And it was in that period, he was like, he just kind of straight up said like, what the heck are you doing? Like, you're called to be like, a follower of Jesus. And he kind of knew what I was doing. And he was just like, I want you to like lead. He didn't wait for me to get my stuff together, if you will, spiritually. He kind of told me to stop. And then once kind of knew I'd stopped doing some of that stuff, he was like, I want you to lead, like preach a sermon. And I was like, I've never done this before. And he's like, well, you'll figure it out. And he kind of helped me a little bit, but very much like just kind of a pushed in the deep end kind of thing. And so, yeah, I hope to God no one ever finds that. I don't think it was recorded, but he just had me do a couple of sermons at youth group. And then not too long after, he was like, I don't know if this is a horrible idea or what, but they had a service. This would definitely not fly on the PCA, a service where they were like, the youth are going to lead the Sunday service. Mm-hmm. So we did like the music. I didn't do the music. My mixtape had not been released at that point. That came later.
This is a real thing, by the way, for you listening. There does exist a mixtape somewhere.
5-song mixtape that I recorded in a 18-hour period in high school.
Was it dedicated to Brenna? Is that right?
No, it was
Oh,
dedicated to the angsty struggles. Actually, kind of some of the stuff of seeking God and not finding Him. It's called.
What if you listened to it and it was like really good, and
It's
you were
not
just
very
shocked?
good. It has a little bit of like Kid Cudi angst to it, but like if he was a Christian,
we've got to get this,
I know.
get a hand on this.
I have it on my phone.
As your departing gift.
Yes.
At least to me and Matt, you can read it.
That's what we want.
Everybody, look under your seat.
The vote. The vote on Sunday.
The final.
The dissolving vote on Sunday is contingent
There you
upon
go.
you granting this gift.
Do that.
Just
Let's do that.
Sorry,
the whole
I derailed
worship-
us. Keep
the whole
going.
worship list is Nebula Life, the mixtape.
That's awesome.
The Presbytery would not be thrilled about that.
You were saying that you were preaching.
Yeah,
for
so they
the
had
service,
they had a
the youth
service, and they were just like, yeah, like I think we did like a 2-part sermon. Me and another guy, the pastor's son, Hayden. Shout out Hayden. Hayden Harnerkamp and I did like 2 sermons. Those might be on the internet, but I really hope they're not. I've looked really hard for them to try to make sure they're taken down if they're up there. So I don't want to know what I said.
Our church did a similar thing. I think Easter Sundays was youth led. Yeah,
Wow.
So they did like a sermon.
yeah. And I remember I preached one of them, and
Can we find it? on
I
the
was
internet?
writing it at like pretty sure it was like 12 o'clock at night the night before.
Of course.
And my buddy was there, and he's like, I'm going to bed. I'm like, you're not going to bed. And I said, I'll give you $1 for every shot of espresso you drink.
Wow.
So he went over and he just made 5 shots of espresso and then just fell asleep immediately. Like it did not help him. And I was still alone writing it. But
Wow.
Wow, that's amazing.
so churches do this, I guess.
Yeah.
do it. Yeah,
Okay.
they do
That
it.
that encourages me that we were not the only one. Yeah. I remember I had it like on a ghetto, like 70-page Walmart notebook thing. And I like wrote it out, and I couldn't read my own handwriting really.
I don't even think anyone like read it over before I did it.
Oh, same. But I couldn't read my own. So I just started winging it.
Yeah.
I remember I said a line that's so bad. And as the kids would say, is utterly cringe, which was like, I am the spoon and I am stirring your spirit. And that was just, I repent, Lord. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Anyway, so yeah, it was kind of those few things that he was just like, hey, like you should really consider a call to ministry. And I didn't want to do that. I was like, absolutely not. I'm not a pastor. Pastors don't ask questions like this. Pastors don't, pastors aren't as mean as I am or as cynical as I am. They're much more people. People. Yeah. People. They're better with people than I am.
People.
Yeah. And so I went off to college to Lee. My sister went to Lee. And so I had visited a few times to visit her and really loved it. I wanted to go into business. Still didn't really have, I had a heart for the church, but not a heart to, or at least a thought to go into pastoral ministry. And it was in the Bible Corps. You have to take a Bible Corps at Lee, and I think you do in a lot of other Christian colleges. And it was in my intro to theology class that my professor, Skip Jenkins, like really set my heart on fire for studying the Bible. Like while I had some good teaching in high school, I hadn't really had like the whole system laid out for me. I knew nothing about church history. I knew nothing about like how the Bible fits together. Yeah, all the sermons I had done were basically TED Talks with like a couple of sprinkles of like, text. I'm pretty sure I like bootlegged a Judah Smith sermon at one point, like in youth group. I was just like, I'm just going to take his illustration and use it as my own. This is like a confession. I don't know if there's like a statute of limitations on these things, but I think I used one of his illustrations as my own. I didn't give him credit, so you can arrest me if you want to.
You're canceled.
But yeah, so that was a long way to say like whatever good was in my sermons, it was garbage. Like it wasn't actually like taking the Bible and theology and then applying it. It was just kind of like hodgepodging together things I'd heard from Judah Smith sermons and random thoughts me and my friends had. And so it was a Pandora's box in a good way. I think Pandora's box is a negative connotation when I was like studying theology. I also hated accounting. I was in my accounting class because I was a business major. And I was like, this is destroying my soul. I never want to do this. I want to die every time I open up a spreadsheet. So shout out to all the accountants of the world. You're doing the Lord's work, but I could never do that. And so I was just switched my major to theology. Still didn't have a plan for pastoral ministry. Again, I was operating under the assumption that pastors are TED Talk, go-getter, Willow Creek, seeker-sensitive kind of stuff. And I was like, definitely not that. I feel like I turned people away from, like I turned the crowds away. I'm not a crowd gatherer kind of person. And so, yeah, I wanted to be a professor. And so I started really devoting myself to study. I wanted to go teach church history. That was my goal for 2 years. It was in my studies of theology that I came across Augustine, and my professor, Skip, had the audacity to suggest that I enroll in the senior level class called the City of God. And I was a sophomore, and it kicked my butt because it was so hard. It was my first like theology major class, and we had to read the City of God. And like the longest book I'd read at that point was like Desiring God by John Piper. And so I had no idea what half of it said. Anyway, but it was through that I kind of realized like, oh, I may actually be that, and Johnny Pipe's book, Desiring God. I realized basically like I may have a reformed understanding of the faith, like that the story's not primarily about me and my response to God and what I can do for God and the plans God has for me, but it's about, the plan God has for the world and how I fit in that, not how he fits in my story, and how he's the author and the finisher of my salvation. And that, I feel like that was where the gospel was really made clear to me for the first time, that I was saved by grace through faith. And that God, was really the one doing it. I think up until that point, I'd been operating under the assumption that the Christian life was like figuring out God's purpose for your life, and like doing great things for God. And it's great, do great things for God, and God has a purpose for you, but that's definitely not the center of the gospel. It's a tangential implication of it. And just realizing that Christianity is about delighting in God. And, the Westminster Shorter Catechism was really, the first question was really pivotal for me. Like, our purpose is to glorify God. And I loved John Piper's little subtle change, by enjoying him forever. Like I never thought, as simple as it sounds, that God is someone to be enjoyed. I thought he was kind of like a director, or like someone, I don't know, someone to appease, or someone to like figure out the mystery of his will. Anyway, and so that kind of was really a domino affected into, I was at a Pentecostal church, then I went to a Southern Baptist church, and found myself into a PCA church. And Philip Keynes, one of the pastors, he's still a pastor there at Trinity Pres in Cleveland, Tennessee, was really just influential in showing me like the bread and butter stuff of pastoral ministry. And yeah, I think it was there I was like, oh, this might be kind of where I want to land, but I still wasn't sure. So I went to Gordon Conwell as opposed to a Presbyterian seminary, because I wasn't entirely sure. And how I even ended up at Gordon Conwell was a funny story, but I'm taking too long anyway, so I'll skip that part. And I saw a job opening for global missions intern at First Presbyterian Church Ipswich that had just left the OPC the month before. And I had found out I was going to Gordon Conwell mid-April of 2017. I was getting married in a month. Very anxious, because I was like, I don't know if we're going to be in Chicago, or there's a seminary up there, or Birmingham, a seminary down there, or here. And the Lord led me to Gordon Conwell, and wasn't entirely sure if I was Presbyterian. So I started the interview process. I interviewed with the missions team, and then I show up to my interview with the pastors, and Philip Keynes was great, but Philip, maybe doubt you're ever going to watch this, but he was a suit and tie Presbyterian, and the PCA in the South is like, you wear suits, tuck in your shirt. And so I'm like, this is an interview, right? I wore my wedding suit, which I think was the only one that fit me very well. The other ones were like Goodwill suits that look super like bad. And so I show up in sweet Pastor Greg's office with a 3-piece suit, mind you, that I wore to my wedding a month before.
Nice.
And just show up on time, get my little studious Presbyterian vibe on. And Greg and Derek walk in like goofing off with VBS t-shirts.
Like bright green
neon
Nice.
shirts. And I'm like, all right, I think
Things are a little different. Right?
yeah, I think one of my hesitancies with Presbyterianism, and this shouldn't be a surprise, is I didn't feel like very straight laced enough. Like I'm not a very serious person. And I was like,
Even though you wanted to call down the fire on the
Easter bunny.
Easter bunny.
that's true.
Easter egg bunny.
It's either one or two registers, like fart jokes or calling down fire on Christians for doing Easter egg hunts. That's the only two modes I operate in. And so I was like, I think the PCA can operate in the fire judgment on the Easter bunny, but I don't know about fart jokes or whatever. Sorry, this is on the internet, so I'm a little unhinged
It's all
today.
good. Man. It's all good.
But yeah, I was like, okay, they're wearing short sleeve t-shirts to an interview. It was a global missions intern interview. I don't know why I thought I had to wear a suit.
Well, and it was VBS at our church, so
Yeah.
it wasn't like Greg and I chose those.
No. You chose to it. Yeah, and you guys were just like really chill. And anyway, there was a long process, maybe about a year, where we used to do in the good old days, like seminary lunches. The good old days when we actually had like seminarians.
5 of them.
Yeah,
at a
and
time.
so we'd get some Pomodori's pizza.
Yep.
John Conant, Derek, and Greg would walk us through all our random questions. And so I probably annoyingly asked you guys too many questions. But it was through that, and then I think just through deep fellowship with Derek, Greg, and John Conant, that is, that really just felt like, okay, I think I had a lot of questions, a lot of hesitancies about the PCA, very, very different from Pentecostalism, and
Which is what you grew up with.
which is like at that point I moved here when I was 21. So I had only been in a PCA church for like 2 years. And so for 18 of those years, it was like hour-long worship services. If somebody's not speaking in tongues, it's not
It
a
doesn't
legit
count.
service.
Yeah.
Which again, you know, I have deep appreciation for those things, but it was very foreign to me. Like I could read John Piper, but I was like, the worship service part felt weird. Anyway, but it was meeting with these guys, reading Center Church by Tim Keller. I read that the summer we got here, and that was also very pivotal because I think that finally put a lot of my worries about am I called to pastoral ministry to rest. I mean, I think that's a perennial question a lot of pastors wrestle with, like, am I called to this? But I'd still wanted maybe to be a professor, but it was actually coming across Tim Keller's ministry where I was like, oh, he's doing 3 things I'd never seen before. And I think Derek and Greg and John were also doing them. But I started reading Tim Keller right before I came here. So I came across him first. And then I saw them do it in action. It was just like really preaching the Bible in an orthodox way. Really, really going deep and addressing unbelievers and answering questions, particularly. Like that was like, it was astounding to me that he was answering questions of unbelievers, because something else that was pretty pivotal in my testimony is my best friend, really my 2 best friends in high school, my junior and senior year, were not believers. And one of my best friends had a whole lot of questions about the faith, and I just could not answer them because I had those same questions. And me saying I just felt the Lord's presence wasn't enough for him, reasonably so, right? And so I kind of made it this mission, like, of mine. I never like said it, but it kind of became a heartbeat of mine, like, to respond to people's questions, you know. And in some ways, that was even the heart of us wanting to do this podcast, was like, for the people like my friend that had all these questions that, you know, no one was answering them. Like, let's just at least talk about them. So anyway, yeah, that just hearing Tim Keller do that was huge and pivotal. And then also just being in a non-Christian context that he was in. And then obviously this church is in, I think Gordon Conwell was huge. And just seeing those 3 things come together was crazy for me. So that's how I became a Presbyterian. So I took way too long.
No, that was
Like
great.
35 minutes, but those are the things, and I can keep sharing other things, but I feel like maybe the rest is, people already know the rest, but that's kind of brings me up to the church.
Yeah. Quick question based on kind of you growing up and having all these questions, and it seems like maybe for part of the time feeling like they weren't getting answered. How does this impact how you think you're going to parent? Like, I don't know. I kind of think I know the answer to that. Like, I know you, so I know how I think you would parent, but like, how are you gonna have you thought about that? I know you have because you think about everything, but
I think that's a great question. It's a wake up call to be intentional with my family as I am with the church. And I've already seen in my own heart a tendency, if someone in the church comes in, like asks me a question, I'm like, oh yes, like let's talk about it. And like if Brenna asks a question, I'm sometimes too quick to be like, go look at the podcast. I don't know. We already talked about that. And just to be intentional and to prioritize, to pastor my family first, even though you're not really fully a pastor of your family, but there are pastor-like elements that every dad should have. And one is answering and responding to questions. And if you don't know the answer, work your butt off to find out as best as you can and be honest about not knowing what you don't know. But yeah, I think that's a good question. It's just like wanting to be always having time to sit and respond to the why.
Yeah.
That's good.
Great. Thanks for sharing.
Yeah.
Derek, you're up, man.
You want me? Okay. So
Deroni.
I'll try to give more of the medium version of it. But, much like Nathaniel, grew up in a Christian home as well. But I think even my parents and certainly my brother would say that it was a pretty nominal Christian home. We went to church every week, but I would actually say that, and I think my parents would agree that it wasn't until I was in middle school and my brother was in early high school that for the four of us, we really came to faith. So we
real quick, just for background for people, you grew up in Dallas, right?
The Texas area,
Texas
kind of
area,
all over the place, yeah.
And then
it's just all the same.
And like, what type of nominal Christian? Like, what type
Methodist.
of okay, Methodist?
Yeah. So
okay.
my dad's family was Catholic by background. My mom's was Baptist, and so my understanding is that when they got married, they were like, "Let's try something else."
Sure.
And Methodism is what they decided on. But I remember growing up and. This was back when if you went to Sunday school every Sunday, you would get attendance pins.
Nice.
And so like I had 2 years perfect attendance in Sunday school. If that tells you. We were there every week.
They look at those at the gates of heaven.
They probably do. Yeah, they probably do.
They're like,
and laugh.
Someone sits there and they tally them up. They go, okay,
We'll let
he's
this
good.
guy in.
Yeah.
But, again, I do think that for all of us, it was just kind of like that was what you did. We were caught in what I think church historians would just really describe as Christendom. It was a cultural Christianity, but it wasn't by any way a personal walk, a relationship with the Lord. And even the corporate dynamic of it didn't exist. At least it wasn't experienced in the church. It wasn't, we're here to commune with one another and with the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. It's Sunday morning. What else are you going to do? Go to church. That's just what good Americans and good Texans do. And so that kind of persisted all the way up through kind of 5th and 6th grade. I do remember there was a point in time where when I became a 5th grader at my church, and this was in Hobbs, New Mexico, because my dad worked in the oil field. We moved a lot, every 4 years actually. And the furthest out of Texas we got was about 2 hours into New Mexico. And I remember right before my dad got transferred to Lubbock, which is, and I'll get to that in a minute, where I came to faith. I remember beginning to pay attention on Sunday mornings. And it was, though it wasn't kind of as deep and angsty as kind of the question period that Nathaniel was describing in his testimony, I began just kind of wrestling with the, like, why am I here? Why are we doing this? And part of that may have been because, and if you're familiar with the Methodist Church, you'll understand what this means, but I was an acolyte. So one of my jobs in 5th and 6th grade is that I would walk down at the beginning of the service during the prelude music and I'd light the candles on the altar.
It's powerful.
And then I'd sit on the front row. And so as soon as I was sitting on the front row, I was kind of like, well, maybe I ought to pay attention to what's going on here. So anyway, That again was kind of fifth and sixth grade. Well, when we got transferred, my dad got transferred to Lubbock, Texas. Around that same time was the first time that anybody in my family had ever passed away. And it was my great grandmother on my dad's side that had passed away. And that began bringing up a bunch of questions in my mind. And in particular, kind of the idea of like, well, what is life all about and what happens after you die? And I started asking my mom a bunch of these questions. And I think in one sense, probably became kind of that annoying kid to her. And as best she could, you know, she would reach for the Bible. And I remember there was like a little, almost like a proof texting booklet, you know, that she would pull out, and she'd try to walk me through some passages of scripture and stuff. But it was actually through the relationship that I began to develop with the youth leader, the youth pastor at my church when I got into middle school, that I think in many respects, the reality of those questions began getting answered in a way that I could understand. And it wasn't just somebody opening up the Bible to me and reading a verse and being like, now you're good, right? Because, I mean, again, I just think that even at the time, that in many respects is what my whole family had kind of been indoctrinated into, right? It's just like, read the Bible and figure it out, you know? But Scott Wright, the guy that was my youth pastor in middle school, really invested in me, took the time to really listen to my questions and work me through what scripture had to say in a way that applied and that was understandable. And for me, I can actually point back to, and I know a lot of people can't do this in their testimony, and that's fine, but I can point back to a particular day in my story. It was February 11th of 1989. We were at a youth rally, like a citywide kind of youth gathering. And it was the first time that I remember when someone was preaching the gospel. So again, the good news about who Jesus is and what he's done, that I realized when scripture talks about sin, that applied to me. And the effect of sin being distance and separation from God and death, that applied to me. And that because of what Jesus did in his substitutionary death on the cross, that could apply to me. And so all of a sudden, these dominoes were beginning to kind of knock down during this youth gathering. And I have no doubt that even growing up in the Methodist Church, I assumed that I probably heard the gospel. But at that time, I didn't have ears to hear, you know. But that night in particular, February 11th of 1989 was the night that I remember kind of surrendering my heart to the Lord, or maybe a better way of describing that is when God really called me and when he allowed me to understand in his grace, again, who Jesus is and what he's done and how that can be applied to me. And so for me, again, kind of given the more medium level version of this, that was kind of at the beginning of my seventh grade year, or in the middle of my seventh grade year rather. And right after that, I went into a pretty dark season of spiritual warfare. And I mean, again, I can't necessarily explain it other than to say, like, I felt like my faith was constantly being attacked. And I guess one little nugget of one of the ways that I felt like it was being attacked is I think that what Satan's original kind of mode of operation was in attack for me was the idea of trying to twist my understanding of grace. So I think when I became a believer, when I, prayed the prayer, if you will, in February of 1989, I think I did have a very elementary understanding of grace, but very quickly, I think what Satan tried to do was twist that into this idea of the gospel. What Satan was trying to say was the gospel is not you're accepted, so obey. The gospel is you need to obey so that you can be accepted. And again, he tried in every way that he possibly could to kind of spin that, put that on its head. And I struggled with that for a while. continued meeting with Scott, my youth director. Actually was meeting with a Christian counselor for a while. But this whole season of my life, it kind of sent me into a period of depression, a spiritual depression for sure. And I can't, much like Nathaniel, I can't necessarily even explain when the clouds parted, other than by God's grace and through a lot of investment from a lot of other people. There was a season where the reality of you're accepted, and you're accepted by the work of Jesus, not by your own work, that really dove deep and was planted deep in my heart, and the clouds began to really part and lift. But then to figure out what that was going to look like, what discipleship was going to look like, in the grace of God, certainly took time. And took a lot of investment from other people. And, one kind of funny story that is similar to Nathaniel's in terms of getting me on the trajectory toward ministry. In between my 8th and 9th grade year, our youth pastor left and went to seminary. So Scott left to go to seminary. We were waiting for a new youth pastor. And during that kind of interim period, there was one of the associates at our church came and sat with us during kind of youth Bible study. And so we had big youth group on Sunday nights where middle school and high school would gather together. But then on Wednesday nights, we would separate, and the high schoolers would have their own Bible study and the middle schoolers would have theirs. And this one associate was like, "Hey, Derek, why don't you lead Bible study next week?" And I was like, okay, so I did. I can't exactly remember. It was something in the Gospel of Mark. That's all I remember. But I do remember kind of at the end of the discussion, kind of finishing or whatever. And I can't remember if I asked him, his name was Doug. I can't remember if I asked him or if Doug just volunteered. But like, imagine, a group of about 12 middle schoolers sitting around a circle that I had just led a discussion on. And imagine me kind of looking at Doug and kind of being like, okay, I'm done. And Doug was like, "Thanks, Derek. That wasn't all bad, but," and like he basically went through and like undid most of what I had tried to do, just to kind of really give clarity and truthfulness to my first opportunity with teaching. But by God's grace and with a lot of patience from Doug, and then my next youth director, Duke, and that's a good Texas name, by the way, right?
Duke.
Shout out to Duke. But it was through those relationships. So Scott, my next youth director, Duke, when I went to college, two guys very pivotal in my discipleship there, a guy named Rusty, and another guy named David, both of whom are still doing ministry in Texas now. That I kind of knew through those relationships that I wanted to hopefully have the same kind of impact on the lives of others. And so really from the time that I was in like late middle school, early high school, I kind of felt like I wanted to go into ministry. Mm-hmm. And my assumption, because everybody that I had been around up to the time that I went to college was, well, you do youth ministry and then you kind of move up, if you will, the pastoral professional ladder, right? And kind of the influence that guys like Rusty, who was also a Methodist. So I was a part of the Wesley Foundation when I was in college, which is a Methodist student ministry for college age students. That was where I learned how to play guitar and lead worship. I went to an evangelical free church when I was in college. That was where David Daniels was, my college pastor. So I kind of grew up as a denominational mutt, is what I would describe myself as. But believe it or not, this is another place where Nathaniel and my testimonies kind of overlap. So John Piper was incredibly influential in kind of opening up the Reformed faith for me too. And that happened through the Passion student conferences. So Louis Giglio and John Piper and Beth Moore. And
were you at the Seashells one?
I was at one day. Yeah.
Seashells. Sorry.
Yeah.
That was my John Piper.
We were at one day. I think that was 2000, the summer of 2000. But yeah, I went to all of the Passion conferences. It's a long time ago, guys.
People are like, "What the heck is the seashells?" I'll let you get back
I
to
know
that.
what you're
Don't
talking
don't
about.
waste your life. One
Yeah,
of the
don't
most,
wait your son.
one of the most profound sermons that I think I've ever heard. But yeah, and if you want the reference, Piper basically says that, you shouldn't waste your life looking for seashells on the beach. You should rather, sink your life into living for Jesus.
It's like a critique on like a Reader's Digest article or something
Yep.
like that, right?
That's
It's like,
exactly what it is.
here's how Mary spends her summers,
Yeah, picking up seashells. Yeah, and that on it kind of what he talks about there is, again, that you want to, if you've only got one life, spend it for Jesus. But it was actually through a ton of reading. So I have like a section devoted to John Piper in my own library, where I read a ton of his books. But it was through that then I started reading guys like Jonathan Edwards and then other Reformed theologians, certainly by the time I got to seminary. But again, kind of knew that I would, even when I was in college, kind of knew that I wanted to go to seminary at some point, be in ministry. But got my first chance to do that full time soon after graduating from college, in doing college ministry. And so where I kind of got my start was in Austin, Texas, at the church that I went to when I was a student at UT. And I led worship music. We had a big college Sunday school class of about 700 students on Sunday morning. And so it was like a college worship service in essence. But I led the praise team with Brooke, my wife, and then started leading men's discipleship groups. So would train and equip adult leaders to lead college students. And then in 2005, we moved up here to go to seminary. And for me, like moving into Presbyterianism, when we first started attending church up on the North Shore, we went to First Pres. And part of that was because some friends of ours who were at the seminary took us there. That was where they were going at the time. And started getting to know Pastor Greg and Pastor David, who was the senior pastor at First Pres at the time. And we really had a heart for church planting. The church began kind of investigating the possibility of that. And it wasn't until my last semester, though, of seminary that the domino of infant baptism fell for me, because I was in essence a Reformed Baptist when I got to seminary. But, couldn't quite, for me personally, get over the kind of the hill, if you will, of infant baptism. But Rick Lentz, who was one of my seminary professors, who's an ordained teaching elder in the PCA, was very influential, sat with me. We talked through a number of different aspects of the theology on it. And I'll never forget one of the last conversations. It was the conversation that kind of pushed me over the edge with infant baptism, though. We were sitting in his office and he said, Derek, all the passages of scripture that I would point to, them just as well as I do. But he said, what is your theology of children? What makes your kids any different than the kids of the non-Christians down the road? And I remember that was the question that really kind of opened it up for me, because I was like, well, they are different because they have exposure to the gospel. And he's like, well, what kind of exposure? And I was like, well, like I teach them the gospel as often as I can. We have family devotions sometimes. And he's like, well, what do you teach them? And I mean, again, it was as if he was just fishing, and he all of a sudden had me on the line. And I, started explaining and kind of talking about some of the things that we had been doing as a family. And he was like, well, when you're teaching your kids, what would you say you're kind of trying to show them about God? And I'm like, well, he's a covenant making and covenant keeping God. And he's like, so you're inviting your kids to live within the covenant? And I was kind of like, yeah, in many respects. And
close the deal here.
And essentially he was like, and why would you not allow them to wear the covenant sign? And it was at that moment too that for me, I grew up Methodist, which again, they practice infant baptism, but the church that I went to and served at, both when I was in college and doing college ministry, as an evangelical free church, they actually do not have a stance on baptism. So if the pastor and the elder board want to baptize infants, they can. If they don't, they don't.
Really?
That's, yeah.
Interesting.
Anyway, I had just always assumed, because of my experience in that evangelical free church at the time, my understanding of baptism was, when you get baptized, you're doing it in obedience to God. So my understanding was that baptism was something I did for God, not something that God did for me or God put on me. And it was actually in the process of seminary and the process of reading more in the process of that conversation with Rick Lentz that domino fell for me. Because again, and strangely enough, like it was as he was kind of peppering me with some of those questions, I was quoting at the time Ephesians 6. He was like, Rick Lentz was like, what is something that you teach your kids? And I was like, well, I mean, we trying to teach them the way of Jesus, but like we're also trying to teach them just the way of the historical way of the faith, And I was quoting a section out of Ephesians 6 where Paul is quoting something in the Old Testament. And as I was quoting it, I realized I'm quoting a covenant document. And Paul is quoting something that's coming from the Old Testament. And if I'm inviting my kids to live as if the covenant is true and to live under the covenant, in covenant relationship with God, why would I not allow them to wear the sign? And there are, again, some other aspects of that really helped me, but I won't get into that. But anyway, that's kind of how I became a Presbyterian. And it was at that point too, that in conversations with First Pres and stuff like that they were like, hey, we'd really love for you to come on and at least investigate the possibility of us sending you out as a church planter one day. And so, as they would say, the rest is history. So that's, kind of the medium version of my story, I guess.
I didn't say this, I don't think, but Rick Lentz was the guy I met with when I came up to visit Gordon Conwell. And he essentially was like, if you want to pastor in a post-Christian context, you need to study in a post-Christian context. And I was praying my guts out that whole day, like, Lord, please give me clarity on where to go to seminary. And at that moment, I was like, all right, I'm coming here. And I went down to Gordon, literally walked to the admissions office, signed the papers that I was coming, and called Brennan and was like, we're going to New England. So if it wasn't for Rick Lentz,
there you go.
neither of us would be here.
It's true.
Shout out, Rick.
Speaking of you guys saying neither of us have been here, you guys both mentioned the how pivotal the youth pastors were for you. And you also mentioned like the pastoral ladder, which we typically think of. Like a lot of pastors or a lot of churches will view the youth pastor as just a stepping stone to, lead the pastoral role in which you're leading the congregation. And we've talked about this, how that role is, the youth pastor role isn't given the recognition of importance that it actually is. And that it's to view it as a stepping stone to one thing and not being like the ultimate place where you want to kind of find yourself or whatnot is kind of does harm to the role. And yet you guys both talked about how important that role is.
Yeah.
Any thoughts on just youth pastors or on that role and how churches should be thinking about it? And
It's a great question.
Yeah, I think so. One reality that's probably going to be the case, and it's probably one of the reasons why this idea of the ladder exists, is because oftentimes that is a place where guys before seminary, but before if they're thinking about going to seminary, but before they go, it's a place that's open to them, for doing ministry. And I would say it's great training ground, because the benefit to be able to kind of get your hands dirty with practical ministry, so to speak, and then go to seminary, I think can be helpful. And it just happens to be the pathway for a lot of people who go to seminary. Not always, but oftentimes. And so I don't know that it's going to be avoidable in one sense. that it would still be seen as such. But I do think that, and again, I mean, studies have shown that if kids don't come to faith, before they're 18, then a lot of times it's not that they can't come to faith as adults. Like there are plenty of testimonies to the contrary. But again, if students are growing up in the church, those who come to faith before they're 18, and again, I can't remember what the actual number is, but it's more likely that they're going to stick with the faith going forward. But that being said, some of the research also shows that it's not just the youth pastor, but it's also the parents and other adults feeding into the lives of those students that is so pivotal. And some of the things that I didn't mention just for time, but that I remember very well, is the other youth leaders that were involved at the time. And I remember my own parents being chaperones oftentimes on youth trips, and how pivotal that was for me too, because as my parents were growing in their faith, that was a further opportunity for them to serve within the church, and, another place for them to kind of be involved in my faith journey, if you will. And so I do think that the youth pastor role is definitely a crucial and pivotal moment in the lives of students, certainly in my testimony.
That's a great question. And yeah, I totally agree. I think it's very, my own story, excuse me, has shaped my ministry a lot, meaning specifically like the significance of my youth pastor and the significance of youth leaders, lay youth leaders, were huge. And really, really has shaped my philosophy of ministry. Like, I have zero interest, not that this is even possible in New England, but like of having like a big youth ministry, like get as many kids as you possibly can, because I had so many friends. Like we had for like how small the town was, pretty big youth ministry, like 50 kids coming. The vast majority of them sadly are not following Jesus anymore. It's the people that were really discipled and who were invested in the youth group that were following Jesus. And it's not to say like never seek out people who are like on the fringes. That's not what I'm saying. But it's almost like, I mean, Jesus had this philosophy of ministry, right? Like he preached to the crowds, but he spent the majority of his time with 12 dudes.
Yeah.
Like we don't think about that enough.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I don't think we should make this legalistic formula that like,
only 12.
yeah, or like only 12, or you cap a church at a certain size. But I think it does give you a philosophy of ministry that you go deep with a few as the majority of your ministry. Yeah, like reaching other people is good, outside the church for sure. Jesus did that plenty. But I've always seen the role of a pastor is go deep with the people you can. I remember one of my professors at Gordon Conwell said something really pivotal, because I grew up in a church that was very much like, and again, I think the intention is totally right. And I think even the practice is like reach as many people as you can. And he just said, we should not be trying to reach people we cannot effectively pastor.
Yeah.
As pastors, not talking about like everyone in our church going out with their neighbors, but like as a pastor, where do you spend your time? Because you're limited, you're finite. And if you're always focusing on the people like, on the fringes, and you're neglecting people who are invested, then it's like, are you able to really pastor 500 people effectively? Mm-hmm. No, you're not. Meaning like personally. And so really just going deep. And I think that's been my heart. I don't know how well I've done it, but my goal has been like with our youth is really go deep with a few, like the people that are there that want to be there, just going really deep with them. And even I'd say, in addition to what we just both said, I'd say I've tried, I don't think I've done a good job of this, of telling the people that I think could go into vocational ministry, you should go into vocational ministry. I feel like when I was growing up, it was, at least my church was like, pastors are better than everybody else. It's not true. What I have like heard the vast majority of my life since then is you don't have to go into ministry to do work that matters. Also true. I get the sense that with our church, Derek, please, you know our church better than I do. Like the pendulum has swung too far, meaning that no one's considering vocational ministry.
Yeah.
Like the last time we pumped out, and I'm saying we as First Pres and Center Grace, a full-time pastor, I don't know when.
Right.
That should be a wake-up call.
Right.
And so I've often told some of our students, you should consider ministry. They think I'm joking because I joke way too much, but like seriously, you should consider it.
One of the things that, I mean, again, we as a staff have been talking about recently is, and it's part of our stories, both of our stories too, is also giving people the opportunity, maybe even at times before they're ready for leadership. Now, again, I'm not saying that we should open the Sunday morning, and it's not going to happen. We won't open the Sunday morning pulpit up to people who aren't ready. But I do think giving people the opportunity to get their feet wet in ministry, and then for both of us, people walking beside us after the fact and being like, they're there. It didn't go that well, but, you know, like they didn't immediately, you know, set our wings on fire and say, you're never going to be able to be in ministry because you totally bombed that. And I think again, when you look at the model that Jesus set for us, that's what you see, right? Not only did he invest small and have a huge impact, but you also see on very many occasions that he would send the disciples out probably before they were fully baked, you know? And that was okay. Like he knew we're going to be able to debrief this, and it would be much better for us to debrief this while I am still here in the flesh than for, you know, me to have already been ascended to the right hand of the Father and them really at that point trying to figure it out. But they, even after Jesus had ascended, they were still trying to figure it out.
Yeah.
And
so sorry.
No, go for it.
I was going to say, I think to that point, I hope one of the takeaways from our stories, and that's kind of why I personally gave, and I think you gave some too, like pretty nitty gritty, Nacho Libre, gory, like weird details, is because like, I can't illustrate enough how like if you would have taken people from our church and put them in a time machine and put them back to like 10th grade me, I was so like I was the furthest kind of person that anybody would have ever thought would have been a pastor.
Sure, me too.
And so like the main pushback I've heard, and it's not even just pastor, it could be like full-time vocational ministry, like college ministry, like not just ordained ministry. Like the most common response I hear from the students, and I hope you're listening because this is, I almost want to mention your names, but we're on the internet, so I can't. But I've told, you know, a decent amount of students several times, like you should do it. And the most common response is like, well, I don't know if I can do it. And it's like, do you not see, like, give me somebody in the Bible, or like you look at our stories where you're like, that's a great candidate for ministry. Like Saul was a great candidate for ministry and he sucked.
Just look at
not Saul in the New Testament, Saul in the Old Testament. But like, yeah, it's like God uses these bums like us.
Yep. So true.
As pastors. So don't let like, I guess the moral of the story is don't let like your current situation or personality configuration be a barrier. Like God can use whatever. And I think that's even, I think another reflection I have is just like how God has used our stories to like shape even emphases. I think one thing I forgot to mention, if I can just throw it in at the end, is like God, a huge part of my story, I totally skipped it, was just community in college. And like the tightest community I could have imagined, like at that point, that's what I prayed for. And just seeing like the huge need in our society is loneliness. Like,
oh, for sure.
Like, yeah, there's real problems in our country of like, you know, people don't have enough food on the table, and like, you know, like healthcare, and you know, we could go into all the problems in our society, but like, I don't want to minimize those, but to some degree, the government can help do some of that, or nonprofits can help do some of that. The one thing that really, I think hardly anybody can do nearly as well as the church is be community. And be listening. I remember like one of the most impactful things I've ever heard was in a Godspeed documentary, a documentary called Godspeed, where Eugene Peterson said something so simple. He's like, the thing is nobody has anybody to just listen to them anymore. And it was just like, maybe that's just like a huge part of pastoral ministry. Maybe it's not like we all got to have something great to say, or here, let me give you this perfect verse that's like perfectly applying to your time or your situation, but just being community and listening and seeing the image of God in people. And that's something the Lord has put on my heart. And hopefully, like even as I remember Derek and I were in our blessed Danvers office above a recording studio and
music school.
a music school. The fumes of marijuana permeated into our blessed office space.
That's right.
I think we still have the sign up in Danvers, but we were mapping out. Derek was very gracious to let me into this process, but like mapping out what do we want the mission statement to be. Do you remember this?
Yep.
The whiteboard?
Yep.
And it's just funny because I'm like just thinking now, like our 3 pillars are central gospel, transformational community, and missional movement. I'm not saying like those are Derek and I's personal hobby horses and we forced it on the church, but every church somewhat has a similar mission, but like the nuances are often shaped by our stories. It's like for both of us, the centrality of the gospel is big. For both of us, like community, like there's a lot of ways to say like discipleship, but we chose transformational community. And the missional movement, I think particularly for you was huge and me as well. Yeah. It just, anyway, I could go into more details, but you got a meeting. So, but just wanted to highlight that and hopefully that's an encouragement to other people insofar as they can look to their own story and say, maybe my story can inform what the Lord's calling me to right now.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry, I'm talking too much.
That's good.
Anything to add?
I think that's it. That's
Okay.
good.
Well, I want to say this on behalf of the church body. Thank you, guys. Thank you for sharing this, but also for 100 episodes of what you guys have done. And Nathaniel, everyone wants to give you an extra thank you because we know you'll be moving on soon. And yeah, everybody else, thanks for listening. Once again, this is Center Grace Church here in Beverly, Massachusetts. We worship at 10:15 in the Cumming Center in Beverly. Come worship with us. Sunday school at 9 o'clock beforehand. And, continue to send in your questions. And we hope to see you this Sunday.
Peace.
Peace.
See ya.